I'm Ryan, and today we are going to work on an acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I'll have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the reference photo for color matching. With that said, let's jump into it. So we're going to begin here by taking a small flat-headed brush that's about the size of about 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to take a little bit of my cadmium red light hue and then an equal amount of titanium white, and this should render a nice pink pigment. Now I personally want this to be just a hint brighter, so I'm going to grab a little bit more white, mix that in, and then I'll head to the base of my horizon. I'll work my way across the water with multiple strokes because generally it's easier to render a consistently straight line with multiple little applications rather than a single one. Generally in that case you can curve it one way or the other, and we don't really want that right now. Then I'll start building up once I feel that edge is kind of established and safe. And here yet again you can see multiple strokes. I'm using the smaller flat-headed brush because we do need to work along some sharp edges like this landmass and the water there. And the flat-headed brush is great for those very precise, sharp little applications. Now I'm going to bring it to the edge there. I'm going to hop on over to the other side of this landmass, and I'm just going to start painting that in as well. There we go. Then I'm going to skip a little bit of an area. That way we have some area for light, kind of a nice golden yellow in just a minute. And I'll start applying this a little bit higher up. I'm going to make this another cloud here. So I'm trying to make sure that it's always changing. Here we have this smaller area, here it's bigger, then it kind of moves down. And I want the shape to be consistently inconsistent, because that's what's really going to make it nice and interesting. We don't want our clouds to be straight lines, and we don't want them to be continuous little puffs. So here, you can see that I'm now moving it off the edge. We'll move back up again, continuously just creating all of these nice little openings. Now that we've established all of this really nice pinkish cloud, we're going to start moving in between them and show some of the light that's working its way through. For that, I'm going to take quite a bit of titanium white. I'll take about an equal amount of our cadmium yellow deep hue, and then I'll grab just a hint of our red and I'll mix that over here. That way we have a slightly more orange mixture and we have a slightly more yellow mixture. With the orange, I'm going to now work along the edges of all of my previously established applications. That way it looks like there is a bit of this warm light working its way through these pink clouds. And I'm going to blend it slightly down into the clouds. This can be achieved quite easily if the pink is still wet, but if it isn't, just make sure your brush is just a little bit damp and you'll be able to work your way in there and create a nice soft transition, a little bit of a gradient. You can tell that the pigments aren't too far off, they're actually quite similar, and that's really nice because it means our application in the end here will be really quite subtle. I'm working it on top and on the bottom, and there we go. This is how we're going to establish depth and make sure that things don't look flat. We'll wrap light around subjects, we'll have light shining through subjects, and this is just the beginning of that. There we go. Now what we're going to do is I'll get you a little bit closer and we'll start working in between. As an update, I took a bit of that extra paint off my brush. That way I do have that nice, clean, sharp edge. When you start applying all of this pigment, eventually it can build up on the bristles, work its way down a little bit. And when that happens, it becomes significantly more difficult to use because you no longer have that sharp edge. So just make sure you're frequently taking off the previous colors that you're no longer working with. With that said, I'm now going to grab some of that yellow that we mixed, And I'll work this right after the orange. So here you can see we're slowly just filling in all of those white areas. I'm putting it slightly on top of the orange, but at the same time I'm also moving it out over the white. So it's a solid combination of the two. In some areas here you can see that I'm fully covering the white, and that's okay. We will come back in with another value and continue to make that interesting there. But now we really have a lot of light working its way through all of our clouds. We'll have quite a bit up here. At this point, the clouds, the sky, it doesn't look like much, but all you need is a little bit of patience, and we will get there. Here you can see I'm working very softly over lots of that pink and orange, starting to feel nice and cohesive. All looks like it's blending together. There we go. The yellow and the red, should they mix, will just turn into an orange. So really, we're working with a lot of cohesive colors, and you don't have to worry about messing this area up. It's just meant to be a nice cathartic process. There we go. Now, I'm going to clean my brush a little bit. Just dip it in some water, wipe it off on some paper towel. We'll grab some additional titanium white, move that down here, grab a little bit of our yellow, work that in. That way it's not a pure titanium white and has a bit of warmth in it. And I'll come back and work some of these highlights in there. These are just the brightest areas, the areas where the most light is shining through. And this will be really prevalent later on when we have our darker values. Right now we just have a lot of light pigment, and generally when you're applying very light pigment like this over a canvas that is still mostly white, it isn't really apparent how bright what you're working with is, and so it doesn't have the effect that it will later. So again, it's just another one of those applications where you just kind of need to trust the process and recognize that what you're doing right now is setting up a great future. Blending it down a little bit over a little portion here and there of the pink and the orange. And as you can see, it's starting to look a little bit more natural. Grab a bit more, work some over on this side, just like that. You can work it in between areas. Get creative with it, get a little playful. There we go. I like that a lot. Now we're going to continue moving upwards in the painting, and so I'm going back to more of my pink, but I want it to be a bit lighter for just a little while, right here. So I'm going to take more of our red. We'll mix it right beside our previous red mixture, that way I have a good comparison, and I know that it is indeed a little bit brighter. So there we go. It's a good mix. Like that a lot. And I might throw in a little bit of my cerulean blue, because we're eventually going to transition into a blue up here, and it's good to just get that started. But we don't want much, because if the cerulean blue mixes with the yellow, you'll end up with a green. And that's not the pigment we want right now. So here you can see I'm mixing it over slightly on top of our yellows, down into our other pigments. These are just clouds that are getting light in a slightly different way at a slightly different distance, and that's why they have a slightly different color. There we go. working my way around the drawings of a couple of other clouds, but if I do cover them up, that is okay, because we can always go back and paint them again. As you can see, there really is quite a bit of pink in the sky, and we will play with it. We'll change it up a bit here and there. We'll add some orange, maybe some extra yellow, but we need a base to work on top of. I'm also going over areas a couple of times just in case they're a little bit thin. But this is an area where you have to be cognizant that for a little while the painting's going to look a little bit flat, and that's okay. Generally, your paintings look flat when you don't have gradients, light wrapping around subjects, and right now we don't, because we're only working with a singular pigment. But again, that's okay. Just going to mix up a bit more. Been receiving a lot of requests as of late for skies like this, oceans, beaches, with some really nice sunset colors, but they can be a little bit tricky. So we're just taking this slow. We'll get lots of really nice colors in there. We'll do so in a pragmatic way, and I'll try to explain the whole process. There we go. I'm leaving a little bit of separation here because we are going to transition into our purple, and I want those areas to predominantly be that nice purple. So, there we go. Blending a little bit of that pink down into these previously created clouds, that way it's cohesive and we don't have a hard line. There we are. Now yet again, taking that extra pigment off my brush, we'll get a bit more cerulean blue, work that into that nice light layer, maybe add a hint more red, hint more blue. Together, as you can see, they mix to make a nice bit of purple. And we'll try that right here. I think it's the right purple, but it's a little bit too dark. You have a real contrast between the two, and I want something softer right now. So I'll grab some titanium white. It's better, still not what I want. We'll grab some more titanium white. This is really a lesson just to not grab the first color you mix. Get new colors, play with them until you have what you actually want. And this is that. Because if you look at this color and you look at this color, they're actually the same, or at least a very similar value brightness-wise. One isn't significantly brighter than the other, or darker than the other. And that's what we want. We want something that's nice and cohesive. That way, later on, we can add high contrast clouds and have a real mix of them. Right now, we're just really trying to build as much diversity as we can. So here, as you can see, I'm starting to blend that out. I have some horizontal lines working that way. I'll build it down a little bit, create some more line work. Like I said, we are doing a lot with this pink. And I'll build it out around this landmass here. Can blend it into the pink on the other side. If you find that you're getting a chalky or toothy aesthetic in the canvas, that all of that is showing through, just go back and dampen your brush a little bit. It'll extend the wet life of your paint. It'll help it go on significantly more smooth, and it'll create those softer transitions. I'm also going over the edges of a lot of these with the very soft touches you can see, and that's just going to get a little bit more of a blend, make it slightly more transparent, and that way it builds from something that's less opaque on the edge to something that's very opaque in the middle. And that makes the middle of the cloud look more dense and notable, and the outskirts kind of transition from the sky into the cloud. So again, it makes things feel really nice and cohesive. Here I'm working my way over to the right. And you can see that I've actually been able to move this pigment for quite some time, simply because my brush was damp, and it thinned the paint to the point where I could just kind of keep applying it. There we go. So again, at this point, doesn't look like much, but that's okay. It's not meant to. Now we will make a bit more of that bright pink that we had. There we go. Probably need to make it a little bit more red. And with this, we can now work our way back, soften some things, add some highlights to these clouds, work them back over this cloud, create some added little details. If our purple is still a little bit wet, we'll be able to blend this in really softly, like that, and create those really subtle blends, which is what I'm doing right now. See that? That purple and that pink, they've created their own pigment right there. It's much more interesting. Okay, so far, so good. Let's continue. Adding a bit more pink back into these. Maybe add some little wispy clouds that come off. Maybe add another little horizontal cloud down here. That worked out really well. Softening areas over there. Now we'll mix a bit of a darker purple, so maybe closer to this. So I'll take quite a bit of blue, quite a bit of red, some titanium white. It's quite nice, quite dark, a little bit rich, saturated. Come up to maybe here. Work my way around this cloud. And this is quite a warm purple. It's important to note when you're mixing your reds and your blues if it's a warm or cool, because if it's a bit more cool, it'll lean blue. If it's a bit more warm, it'll lean red. You can create purples of both types, and I think I actually want this to be a bit more cool. So I'm taking extra blue, I'm working that in here, right on top of what we did, following the edges. I'll also go over here a little bit. And I'll work these clouds over top of our previously established clouds now. So again, lots of little horizontal clouds, but also ones that create interesting shapes, like what I'm doing right now. Going back and softening a lot of it. Use minimal pressure around the edges to get those nice soft blends. Create another one right over here. And you see, the more I work it, the more I go over those areas, the softer they get, the more they blend into the previous layers, and the more subtle the cloud becomes. So it's up to you on how much you want to blend those clouds, how soft you want them to get. We're still not up too high, so I'm not going with the most dramatic pigments or the most dramatic clouds. I want something kind of in between right now. So you can see there's a bit of contrast, but it's not too much. Not yet. There we go. So far, so good. I think I'll also make this a bit of a darker cloud. and this as well. There we go. Now my brush is just damp, and I'm going to work over those edges and make them a little bit less sharp. See that? They're a bit softer now. See less of the tooth of the canvas. And in the process, you can actually move the paint around quite a bit and create little offshoots of the clouds if you want. Here I'll do a little bit of a wash, just make that pink a slight bit darker. And now I think we continue with, yet again, a bit more of this just moving upwards. Luckily, we have more on our palette. Work my way around these truly dark clouds, which we'll implement in just a minute. And I am running out of pigment, so you know what, we will do one more mix of this. I'm mixing it on top of our previous mixture, that way I can kind of gauge if it needs to be darker, lighter, more blue, more red. And I think because we're moving higher, I actually will use a bit more blue. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Now yet again, we mix down. So one of the big lessons here is that we started with all of these pinks, these reds, these oranges, very warm pigments, and as you move higher, it gets cooler and cooler. We start to use more of a purple, then it kind of transitions into a bit of a blue, and that's really the trajectory you want with your colors. Here you can see I'm bringing it down. I'm building out some areas that I want to be a little bit more opaque. We can do that with this one. Started with something quite soft, liked it a lot, but I think it could also be a bit more dramatic now. And by making them all initially quite soft, you give yourself a lot more option later on to go in and do this. Here we'll apply another really dark cloud, using the corner to establish a lot of the details. The corner of the brush can be very, very useful for this sort of thing. And we'll fill in all of those little white spots that we had here. You do have to be careful moving this pigment over yellow though, because it is very blue dominant and it can mix into a green. There we are. Grab a bit more. Now I'm just going to move this blue, bluish purple really, all the way up to the top, slowly making it slightly more blue, and then I will check in with you in just a minute. So here's a bit of a wider shot. As you can see, I've gone up and I've added all of this darker blue to the top of the sky, even incorporating a little bit of Mars black on the corners and edges just for a slight vignette effect. But I paused before I finished because this right here is going to be a larger dark cloud, as is this, and if we painted this portion of the sky this same dark blue, it really wouldn't stand out. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take some of that pinkish purple that we have here, I'm going to bring it up right there and then connect it to the sky. That way we have some contrast between this and that. So for this, we'll take some of our cerulean blue, our red, mix those two together, take quite a bit of titanium white, and here, as you can see, just by mixing it in a different area with the pre-existing red and blue that was on my brush from making that mix in conjunction with the titanium white, we're able to make this. And I would assume this purple is a lot like that. There was a good little test. It was successful. So we can throw this right up here. We can even put a little bit down there. And then we'll softly blend it up into the rest of the sky. You can also put a little bit on this side, working it into some of the other clouds by using these horizontal strokes, just like that. And my bluish black is just about dried, so I'll show you how I do that again. Take some blue, take some red, about half the amount of red as you take blue. Make it a blue dominant mixture. Take a little bit of Mars black, take a hint of titanium white just to gray it down a little bit. Make it darker, make it bluer. Come back up to the top here. Still had some purple on my brush, which is why this is now a little bit warmer than the pre-existing coat, but it's working quite well. Going to take some of that extra paint off my brush, grab some extra blue for our mixture, make it a bit cooler, start working in this way. Softly blend it on the edges. That's really nice. And then of course down into those purpley pinks. Soft strokes to make sure it isn't streaky. And now I'm just blending it out. Occasionally I work in diagonal strokes just to move the paint from the top to the bottom or vice versa, but then in the end I do go over it with a horizontal stroke. That way it's nice and cohesive if you do end up seeing any brush strokes in there. But with that, I think we should now get again a little bit closer and work on some of these clouds together. So now we're moving on up to these clouds. I'm still going to be using this same flat-headed brush. This time, however, we're going to make a darker blue for these. So I'll start with some cerulean blue. I'll grab a little bit of Mars black. I'll grab a hint of red because that will still be there. That's a little bit too red though. Grab some more blue, work those in. A little bit more black, make it nice and dark. Hint of titanium white because that will thin it and make it less saturated. Generally, if you want a color to be a bit more subtle, adding a little bit of Mars black and titanium white will mix to make a gray, and that gray will significantly have an effect on the saturation. So for these, I don't want them to pop as much. I want the majority of my colors and saturation to be down here. That's where I want the eye. So this, as you can see, is a bit darker, a bit less saturated, a bit less eye-catching, and that's important. You don't want every part of your painting to be eye-catching. Otherwise the eye won't know where to go. So here, as you can see, I'm kind of starting on the edges of my cloud, and then I'll work my way inwards after. But I like to start on the edges because that's when you have the most amount of paint and you can get the nicest, sharpest application. Have a smaller cloud kind of form down here with that same color. Maybe it can kind of connect right back here, like that. Have another one. And I'm filling in all of the white in the sky with these clouds. I'm also, as I did before, going back over the edges with a very soft little tap, making edges look less hard and sharp. This can also be done with a smaller round-headed brush. This one doesn't have any sharp edges, so it makes this quite easy, but for consistency's sake, I'm going to stick with this brush right now. It's also worth noting that I did go back in and reblend a lot of the bottom. As you could probably tell in the previous clip, it went from something that had a bit of a sharp edge to a bit of a soft edge, and that's just because I went in and I did some extra blending. And when the blends just weren't working, if say I was working on the purple, I'd add a bit more of the pink and then I'd blend those two wet pigments together. Generally, the more layers you do for these sorts of things, the better it will look, because acrylics, they are semi-transparent. When you are using little bits of water and damp brushes, they're even more transparent. And that means you can see the canvas, the tooth, and when you don't have a thick application, generally it can look a little bit more rough. So with a painting like this, I honestly do recommend going over areas, clouds, openings, 2, 3 times. Just refine it, do it again, refine it, do it again. Each time you do it, you'll get better at it. You'll probably learn something new. You'll be more practiced. And that's something I really, really do recommend. If you don't like it, don't get mad. Don't quit. Say, you know what? That's okay. We all need to learn. We all need to try things. By doing it again, I'll become a stronger painter. And it's true, you will. There we go. I don't always get these hour-long lessons right the first time. Sometimes I do it 2, 3 times and get it just right for you. That way, A, I'm not giving you a, not a great lesson, but B, so that I understand it well enough to teach it properly, right? And that's okay. Doesn't really matter how good you get. Sometimes you just need to redo things, try things again. And that's what I did down here. I didn't really redo all of it, but I fixed it up. I did some extra blends. You can tell that this cloud right here, especially back here, up here, it's a little bit thin. You can see the canvas showing through in those brighter areas. All that is the white of the canvas coming through the paint. So we will have to go through and do a secondary layer on all of this. I probably won't always include all of the secondary layers in the actual tutorial though, just because I don't want the tutorials to be, 8 hours long if I have to repaint something over and over again. Using the same techniques, right? Just building up a bit more of a thick layer, sometimes softening things, sometimes making very minor changes. There we go. Working now a bit horizontally just to take out some of those inconsistencies of paint. I'm trying to give it all a fairly equal layer. That way going back and refining is a little bit easier. That said, again, the middle needs to be the most opaque, and if you want, you can make the edges a little bit more transparent, as that'll just create a little bit of depth, show that there's a bit of light and color working its way through the edges of the cloud because those edges are a bit more thin. With that said, here we go again. Before I go in and do my second layer on this, I need to go and do this one. I want that to dry first, because if it doesn't and we just keep applying paint, it will eventually become quite difficult to work with, maybe a little bit muddy, and you'll just be adding paint on top of paint and not really changing or adjusting anything. There we go. There you can see an example of it being very thick. There's an example of it being very thin. Important to look out for. There we go. Creating some little offshoots of this cloud. Make it feel a bit more cohesive in the rest of the world. Maybe incorporate a bit of it down here. Make that one a bit more dramatic. Maybe I'll incorporate this on here, make it a bit more dramatic. And if you feel like, again, it's not really blending, take the paint off your brush, go in with a damp brush, and then just work it out, work it around, like that. Then you can even create little offshoots again, should you want to. And here again, this is just me going back to a previous area and changing things up, refining things, maybe connecting these two clouds through a thin cloud, having fun with it like that. Now I'll go back up here and I'll just soften these edges a little bit, little taps. That way it doesn't look too hard and out of place. You will find clouds that do seemingly have hard edges, but I want these to be a bit softer to match the mood of the piece. It's a very relaxed painting, and I want clouds that also look a little bit relaxed. It's important to think about that. Your different subjects, they can have impactful stances, or they can be relaxed, or they can be, one of 100 different things. They can kind of have a playful movement to it. Think about what you want your painting to portray, and then make sure all of the subjects portray that idea as well. Or if you want your piece to make a statement, you could have them, kind of counter one another. Lots of options. Here I'm jumping back over to the other side for a minute, testing it. It's still a little bit wet at this point. I feel like it's tacky. Yeah, it's tacky. When your paint is tacky, how many times can I say that word? What happens is when you go to apply more paint and you have a damp brush, generally you'll kind of rip off the paint that's previously applied on there. You don't want that to happen because then it's difficult to apply. You need to let it fully dry before you come back in, and that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to take maybe a 5-10 minute break, let this dry, probably clean my brush well, that way I don't have any pigment drying up high on the bristles. Maybe make myself a coffee. I've been doing that lately as I've been doing these lessons, and I find it helps immensely. Not necessarily the actual painting process, but just, having the energy to go back and change things and feeling, that confidence to really just get up and do it. So, I'm obviously not advocating that you drink coffee or caffeine or what have you, but maybe a little snack, maybe a couple carbs, who knows. Anyways, I'm just kind of talking at this point. We'll end the clip and then we'll get back to painting. So my little break is over. Our paint is entirely dry. The brushes are now clean, as is the water, and we can continue. And I'm really glad we're doing this, because if you look at some of these spotty areas in here, you can tell that this definitely needs another coat of paint. So we are going to take some of our blue, some of our Mars black, hint of red, and I think I'm actually going to make this a bit more blue, maybe a bit brighter than what we had before. So I'm throwing in slightly more titanium white, slightly less Mars black than what we used. I'm mixing on top of our previous mixture, that way I can still kind of compare and contrast them. And here you can see this is a bit lighter than that. So we'll start here on the edges, like that. And this will be slightly darker, what we're applying right here, than what we had on the palette, because our base layer is quite dark. And again, even though this layer is a little bit more thick, it's still going to be semi-transparent, and we're still going to see those darker layers underneath. So if you want it to be extra bright, make sure that it's a little bit brighter on your palette than what you actually want it to be on your canvas. You can see that this is actually going quite quickly, because the first time we do it, we're kind of figuring where everything goes, right? Here, it's kind of like coloring in. Working over some of the pink that we had, I will go back and kind of interject some of that extra in there, rework it. I think something I'm really trying to advocate in this lesson is just the idea of going back, trying things again, fixing things again, because sunsets can be a little tricky. They can require multiple attempts, multiple layers, and you might get it on your first application, and that's wonderful, but it may still be too thin and you might need to go in and do another layer. So again, it's okay. Have fun with it. Look at it as an opportunity to improve and just get better. Because that's what we want to do. We want to have a nice relaxed time. We want a nice, great painting at the end, but we also want to get better at painting. That way, the next painting, it's easier. We understand it better. We understand the process. And that's what we're working towards here. Okay. So it's a bit more blue. It's a bit more saturated. think I like it a lot. We're not going to know what it truly looks like until it's fully dry because it is a little bit reflective right now. So we'll head on over to the other side, take that same pigment, and proceed. You may also want to go back over your edges and soften things as we did in the past. I'm also trying to make sure that those tiny lines I have remain tiny. Generally, when we go back over previously applied pigments, we can be a bit more loose with it because it is more like coloring in, but we do want to be careful that we're not thickening our subjects, making them bigger, like I did right over here when I accidentally took out part of the pink sky. And that was a good reminder. Hey, you know what? Be a bit more careful, Ryan. So that's what we're doing. Making sure my thin lines stay thin. There we go. Going back over some of the edges, making them nice and soft. And what's actually quite interesting, I'm looking in the monitor of the camera right now, and this looks significantly brighter than this, but I used the same pigment, the same amount of pigment. The difference here is that the way the light's coming in the room, this area is more reflective, and so this looks brighter than that, and that's all it is. So this is also a friendly reminder, if you ever really question in color, stand up, take a couple of steps around your painting, move in varying directions, and that way you can get some different views and see how it's actually working rather than how the light's bouncing off varying portions. So with that said, I'm actually really happy with how that turned out right there. I am going to mix some pink to work back in, and you know what? I think it needs to be a little bit dark, so we'll take some blue, take some red, about an even mixture I think to start, a little bit of titanium white. How does that work there? It's not bad, could be a little bit brighter. Purple is something I frequently misjudge the color of. We'll start here. Some colors come more natural to people, I think. And this one just isn't one that does with me. So I have to give it a couple tries sometimes. Working this out. Create a larger opening here. This wasn't something that was in the initial painting, but it's something that we now have the opportunity to work in because of our initial mess up. See how I did that backwards? Pretty impressive. Arguably more impressive than the painting. It's not because I don't like the painting. So what I'm learning here is that that is a little bit too bright. If you look at its value in contrast with the rest of the pinks, the purples, where else do you find something that bright? The only other application is the yellow. Even this pink is a lesser value than that. So we need to make that quite a bit darker. Grab some blue, grab some red, come back in. It's a little bit too red, grab some more blue. Test it over here this time, much better. So much better. Excellent. I'm rotating my brush like that because I have pigment on the other side. There we go. Now we have a lot of pigment right there, so going back and changing that dramatically isn't really an option at this point. We would have to let that dry, but I think it did settle out in a good area. And what's great about the pigment we just came to, we can connect this right here down a little bit more. Create a bit more diversity and light in the sky. I say that, the actual light in the sky outside just got a little bit darker. Kind of funny. We have a cloud. which is actually an important thing to mention because that will change the reflective properties of this and that. And that's something to also be cognizant of while painting. Is it a cloudy day? Is it a semi-cloudy day? Is the sun going to be coming out randomly? If it is, it's going to be changing the lighting and the reflections on your painting. I used to try really hard to paint exclusively, at least on video, on days where the light was consistent. So it was either cloudy or it was sunny. It wasn't a mix of the two. That way each shot could be extremely consistent. But I've kind of had other thoughts about that. And I kind of just, I feel like when you're learning this, you should learn from the real experience, right? And in the real world, in the real experience, you're probably not going to be able to choose absolutely every day you paint. Might be a Sunday and you say, oh, you know what, I only have this Sunday to paint, and I have to paint in whatever lighting conditions I have. So I've started painting when it is somewhat cloudy, somewhat sunny. That way you can see these experiences, and the fact that the canvas right now is a little bit darker than what it was a little while ago. So hopefully that's helpful. With that, I am going to take a little bit more blue, work that over here. You know what, I'm going to make a darker blue. Just a hint of red, but a lot of blue. Bit of titanium white, and I think I'm actually going to brighten this area a little bit and make it slightly more blue. We just added all of this purple, so this area is a bit wet, makes blending with it really easy. So I'm blending into my purples, I'm blending upwards, trying to create a soft gradient. I'll work my way around / sometimes on top of my clouds. And I'm doing this just because I want a bit more blue down in the water, and if it's up here and kind of pre-established, it'll feel much more cohesive. But it isn't much. Just a nice little subtle addition. Going over part of our pink here, pinkish purple. So here we have a wider shot of our sky, our clouds, and at this point I'm actually really happy with it. We might go back later on and make some slight changes, but for the most part I think we are ready to move on. So I'm going to head down into these two land masses that we have right here and here. I'm still going to be using this smaller flat-headed brush. It's a very versatile little guy here. I'm going to take some Mars Black, as you can see. I'll take a hint of titanium white, and I'll take a hint of our blue as well. Mix those up, it'll be a nice little silhouette color with a little bit of depth, and because it has the blue, it'll feel cohesive. It'll feel like it exists within the same world. It has a bit of reflected light on it. And I'm just going to use the nice sharp edge of this brush to craft the edges of our landmass. Now I'm continuously working the edge first because I have the most amount of paint, and that's generally when you can create the sharpest, most exact impressions when you do have a lot of paint. So I'm just working here, I'm doing lots of little taps, as you can see, just letting the corner of the brush protrude on top of the previously applied pigment. That way, we have all of these little impressions for trees on this landmass in the background. And then once I have that applied, I'll just work my way in. As you can see here, I'm starting to run out of paint, so I'm going to stop moving it about and kind of changing its position, because the more I do that, the more I'll thin it, and then the more layers we'll have to do. So I'll grab some additional paint instead. I'll work my horizon line on here. Still just using a myriad of horizontal strokes. And then once I feel I have that nice base, I'll work my way back in. There we go. I think I might also add another one over here. Just a tiny one. That way I have some balance. We have two on this side of the painting. Having one over here will be a nice way of keeping that even. There we go. And now we head over to the big one. So again, Mars black, a little bit of blue, a little bit of white. Mix those together. I'll head for the edge, and this is going to be a bit more detailed, so I'm going to pull the camera a little bit closer. So what I'm doing, yet again, is taking the corner of my brush and tapping on all of these little impressions on the outskirts. That way they look like the implication of trees and foliage. Just like that. You can see there are little bits of pink showing through as well. There's some on the top, on the sides, on the bottom, and then there's some pink right there. And that's just to show that there's light moving through some of these trees. So I'm going to leave slight openings here and there. Not of white, but of the pink showing through. And that's going to make it a bit more interesting, give it some added depth. There you can see a lot of pink showing through. Just refine it a little bit. And this landmass will be a bit closer than these ones, and that's why you see the detail and all of these impressions to a greater degree. Rotating my brush so that I get a different impression each time. And then we'll go back to that horizontal bottom, and I'll just start filling it in. So as you can see, that is now filled in. It's starting to look significantly more complete, and we can start moving down in the painting. And I'm going to kind of section off our portions of water here because there is a lot of it, and taking on all of that at once can be a little bit intimidating. So we're initially just going to work on this little triangle right here. I'm still going to be using this smaller brush because we've used it for most everything. At this point, it's about keeping those strokes and those applications looking really nice and cohesive. And so yet again, I'm just going to take this brush, make sure that it's a little bit damp. We'll head to our palette and mix a dark base color. This is going to be the color for our water. On top of it, we will build highlights, but right now we just need a flat, dark base. I want this to be a blue with a hint of red. So I'll add that in there. And I want it to be right in between this darkness and this darkness. So I'll take some Mars black. I'll take a little bit of titanium white, not too much. If you have extra, just wipe that off in another area of your palette. Grab a bit more red, not too much though. And I'll test this right underneath this landmass, that way I can see what it's like contrast-wise. And I'll move it out a little bit, that way I'm giving it a fair shake. I do think that is about the same darkness, so we should make it a little bit brighter. Add some extra titanium white. I'll go in with this, not directly on top of our previous mixture, just because it would mix and we wouldn't get an accurate representation. That's closer. I think that's actually it. Yeah, I like that a lot. So now I'll blend this over to this one, recognizing that this little patch will be a little bit darker, so we'll have to go over it with a bit more paint. But you can tell that the difference between them is incredibly subtle, and that's okay. Here I'm making lots of little strokes. Grabbed a bit more water from my brush to help me create those nice sharp edges. And right now it'll look like the land is blending in to this, but it won't once we start adding the highlights, so don't worry about that. Mix a bit more, Mars black, titanium white, blue, a bit more blue. If we come across a mixture we like a little bit more, we can also switch to that. We're not too far into the process, and that's just a good habit to get into. Try that. It's a little bit dark. Try that. Oh, that's really nice. Good. And right now we're just working on a nice thick base. So I'm just applying this to all of the open white space in the designated triangular area. And right here, you can see that there is a bit of a wave. So we're going to be cautious of that. And I'll apply this right on top of where that wave is going to be. Just kind of mark that up. And then right under it, I'll apply a bit more. But I've kind of sectioned off this wave right here, because it's going to be darker, at least its base layer is. So I'll continue that by continuing to mix that which we do. There we go. Getting those nice smooth blends. And again, this is the darker area. So we'll take our mixture. And by the way, look at this mixture and then look at it on the canvas. That's what we've been using. It's a good reminder that it isn't always an exact translation. But anyways, I'll take a little bit more blue, a little bit more Mars black, darken it, and I will work in the base of this wave. Starting with a horizontal stroke to the point where I get that semi-sharp edge at the top, and then I'm going to work in this direction with my brush, and that's going to make it look like the wave is moving in that direction a little bit later on. We will need to do a lot of work with this wave. Right now we're just kind of plotting its position. Now I'm going to take a couple steps back, see if I like the differences in values that we have here, if this is too dark, if it's too light, how I feel about it there, and then we can continue and progress. After stepping back, I did decide that I do want it to be a little bit brighter, so I'm going to go over the entirety of this again, just with a slightly lighter pigment, recognizing that it will mix with what we just applied. So I'll probably compensate a little bit more with the bright pigments. There we go. We'll give this a try. Coming up here, oh, that's so much better. Yeah. Again, friendly reminder, play with these things, have fun with them. Work with it until you have what you actually like. I say what you actually like. I actually did like what we just had. I guess what you really, really want. Because there are probably 10 steps in there that you like. But it's important that we, don't settle here. Let's make it something special. There we go. It's a bit brighter. And now so is the bottom of the wave. From there, I'm going to let that dry completely, and then we'll jump back into it with some highlights and some depth. So heading back into this, I'm going to take a little bit of our red and about maybe 3 times that in titanium white. We want this to be really quite bright because it will be semi-transparent. You will see that bluish purple underneath, and I just want this to stand out as we're now making the light for the tops of our waves. So I'm going to begin here by looking at this wave that I've just have this dark impression of, and I'm going to give it a nice sharper top by just kind of dancing around like this, making lots of little taps. That way it looks like there's water moving and it isn't perfectly still. And I'm just working my way from one end to the other. It's best when your brush is semi-damp. Mine is about to run out of water, so while it still has paint on it, I'm still going to put it in some water, wipe off the excess, come back, grab new paint. That way I can continue getting those nice sharp lines like that. Then we can move the water down a little bit as it starts to fall. We'll be relatively selective with this though, because this wave, it's still a bit far away. We don't want it to have too much detail, otherwise the ones in the foreground won't really stand out the way we want. So I'm picking some areas, and then I'm doing this little shape down. That way it looks like it's falling. But this is all water that's relatively thin, so it has a lot of this warm light moving through it. Trying to make sure that each falling area looks a little bit different from the one next to it. And that it all progresses naturally. There we go. Now I'll move right behind it. And I'm just going to work on a slight angle. So you see my brush is moving in this direction as a whole. And I'm just moving some of the water that's up a little bit, that has a bit of a highlight out. As you get farther and farther away though, you don't actually see individual waves, you kind of see clusters of them. And they look more like lines, like this on the horizon. So we move from something that's a bit more angular, which is the water moving in actual individual little areas of it, to something that's essentially just horizontal. I'm letting my paint run out as we move farther and farther back. That way it gets more and more subtle. So far, so good. Now this right here, it's a little bit closer to us, but as we move over to the left, it gets farther away, so I'm not really doing this transition area with the diagonal strokes. Here it's almost just all horizontal. Putting a bit more light in the openings. But still a little bit over the darker areas as well. Again, there's very little paint on my brush. It's really just a lot of water with a little bit of the pink pigment. And that's what's letting me get all of these very soft, very subtle applications and movements. There we go. Now we can go back in here a little bit later and continue to touch it up, but for now I want to leave it fairly simple, that way it doesn't distract from the foreground. And if we decide later on that we do need it to have a bit more detail, then we can come back in and play with it then. But for now, I think I will stop and we will move closer down to us in the painting. As we progress downwards in the painting, we'll find ourselves at another wave right about here. So yet again, we're mixing a darker pigment with quite a bit of Mars Black, blue, and a little bit of titanium white as well. We'll throw these together see what we end up with. And as per usual, I will throw just a hint of red in there. Not too much though. Work that right at the bottom, like so. Kind of have it move from the bottom here up. And then there will be a bit of a peak right around here. Then we'll move right back down. Like that. Now I'm going to expand the wave a little bit, at least the darker under portion. And generally the majority of the under portion of a wave is darker because it's thick and not much light can move through it. So there we have a good start to it. Grab a bit more pigment. It'll get smaller and smaller as we move towards the left because perspective will make it look smaller. And it'll be larger as we are over here to the right. Because, yet again, while it's probably the same size, it's just going to look bigger because we're closer to it. Now, from there, yet again, we're going to move forward, and we're going to do so with a bit of a slightly brighter pigment, but not significantly brighter. So again, more blue, Mars black, a bit more titanium white than before, and a hint more red from before as well. As we move forward, we're slowly going to incorporate more and more red, and we'll have significantly more pronounced pinkish highlights in the waves. As I blend this, I'm blending up with a little bit of a swoop, like that. That way we have some detail and some movement in our wave. See that? It'll make it a bit more dynamic. Now, as we move forward, more blue, red, titanium white, and again, we want this to slowly get to be a little bit more pink. We're going to use a very dark red for our sand color. So if we start transitioning now, it'll look really natural. So now we're just going to continue mixing up a bit more of that lighter purple. We're going to progressively make it even lighter, and we'll work it forward here in the painting. As I connect with the others, I'm doing a combination of strokes that move up like this, and also some that are a little bit more horizontal. You can also move some strokes directly on top of that previous application, like that, to show little bits of water that are slightly higher, and all of the blue that shows through in between will look like shadows of all of this water that's raised. So I'm just moving that back. As you can tell right here, it's really quite thin. So you can either add a lot more paint or go back and do additional layers. I think I'll personally opt for different layers. That way I can make small tweaks to the colors and adjust things as need be. I think at just about the 2-hour mark of every painting lesson, I temporarily lose the ability to speak and communicate. I think that is occurring in this clip. Now, generally, that lasts for maybe 2 clips, 3 if we're unlucky. But then, for whatever reason, I can speak again. So, fair warning, I think we are entering that zone, though I will still try my best to be loquacious, but still continuously informative, and not just ridiculous. With that said, here we are mixing more and more of that pigment and carrying that forward in the painting. This might be a little bit too bright. Grab a small hint of Mars Black, work that in there. Much better, so much better. I want the majority of my lighter pigments to be on this side, just because that's what's closer to us, the audience, the viewer. And then I'm working this all the way to the edge of my water. I did switch over to the larger 1-inch flat-headed brush to do this just because there's a lot of surface area to cover, and I also made this area right here and this area right here a little bit darker than this area and this area. And that's because the light here, it's going to stream down, this will be a little bit brighter, this right here, it's going to stream down, this will be a little bit brighter. So I'm just creating very slight little shadows on this middle spot and then this spot over here to the left using this. The blends here were done with horizontal strokes, and then as it moved up into the wave, well, you saw that it was with a bit more of a wispy motion. With that said, we are now going to move on to adding some highlights and interesting little details in the wave. So we're back to that smaller flat-headed brush. I'm going to take some of our Cerulean blue, I'll take some titanium white, and then I'll also grab a little bit of Mars Black so it isn't too bright or saturated to begin with. There we go. I like that a lot. And this is going to be for a lot of the wave that's a bit more foamy. As you start to move into the shoreline, it does get generally a bit more white, but in scenarios like this, lighting situations like this, it'll probably look a bit more cool, a bit more blue, it'll have a shadow on it. So, for this, we're going to start at the top of the wave. This is a highlight like this, except it has a shadow on it. And I'm going to have it rolling down the wave instead. So it's not crashing, it's not moving like that, it's more of a hump. So here you can see I'm creating these tops, I'm rolling it, I'll create extra little areas that I can connect to. I'm really excited for you to see what this turns into. It is really, really neat. Again, I'm working my way up, and then as I get down here, I start to be significantly more horizontal with my stroke. So now, just like that. Now, this area right here is still a little bit wet for me, so I'm getting a blend between the two, and that's okay, it's going to make it more subtle, but if you do find that, you should either go in with more paint, or intend to go back in later and just do more with it. Here, however, I'll wait for that to dry, I'll come back up here, just create additional little details here in the water, little taps, trying to get different widths, angles, and sizes for this water that's moving over. And you know what, I think I'll get you a bit closer as we progress with this. So now we are really quite close. We'll take a bit more of that paint, find a nice spot on here, roll it down, and then move into the horizontal. I'll also pick little areas that can kind of jet out, either upwards or downwards. Create all of these little details. Might even just use the corner of the brush occasionally. And through this, like any other part of your painting, you eventually will run out of pigment on your brush. You'll get markings that are significantly less stark, and those are actually really, really nice. They just make it look like there's even more shadow. So don't worry about that. You don't need a fresh amount of paint every time you're applying. Just make sure that your brush is regularly damp. That way you get those nice sharp impressions. Here I'm going over a couple of areas numerous times just to make sure it's well applied, relatively opaque. And this is where it starts to roll onto the sand. So again, a lot of horizontal strokes, but also a couple that are kind of curved and moving in the same direction as the wave. This is really built over time. It's built with patience. The smaller markings you can get in the details, the better, but you also want a couple larger marks too. You want it to be really diverse. You want multiple shapes and sizes. You want it to be consistently changing. You want some to be more transparent, some to be more opaque. You can tell it's quite dark right now because we don't have too many layers. So it's this really nice, calm, subtle look to it. That said, you can definitely make it brighter. Just do more layers, use slightly lighter pigments. We may go back in and do that together later. We'll see. Grab a bit more. This is starting to dry, so now you can see that I'm getting an actual blue on top of it rather than what this was. But as the paint starts to run out, it will get transparent like that again. I'm going to keep the top of this edge here quite sharp, and I'll blend down the bottom a little bit. I'll do that here as well. Give you another example of that in a second. Blue, white, a little bit of black. There we go. So again, sharp edge, a little bit of a blend down. And I'm going to do that for all of the areas in the foreground, or at least all of the larger strokes. That way it looks like the light's hitting the top, and then it's blending its way down into the shadow. Now I started making some really large strokes in there. Be careful that you only make a couple. Here I'm just laying the foundation. And then we can get back to smaller strokes. I think we'll make it a bit more gray though. So I'll grab a hint more Mars Black, work that in. A bit more blue, a bit more white. And here I'm actually going to start doing a little bit of a tap, a little bit of a movement. That way the sand is showing underneath, but it looks like the water has a lot of very small movement in it, like when it rolls up over sand. So there are lots of open areas, lots of semi-transparent areas, but there are also lots of little details. And these are only really going to exist here in the foreground, and then it'll turn more into horizontal lines in the background, just like our more pink lines up at the top. I'm going to get a bit more water on my brush. Maybe a bit more titanium white in there. Going over a couple areas to make them more opaque. Now as we get closer here into the foreground, I am going to make it nice and sharp because we're really going to see that detail. So I'm just mixing up a bit more. I want a good amount of nice clean paint. I might go over previously applied areas here and there. And then I'll continue working my way down and to the right. But you can see how it just all slowly builds. All of this is catching a bit more light. We're seeing it happen. You can add this extra bit of light to the tops of your blue streaks as well. Give them a bit of extra dimension. Wrap some light around them. So here's a bit of a wider shot to show you both sections of water that we've worked on, because I feel like both of them are really, really nice, but they don't really feel cohesive at this point, and they're not meant to. Because if you look at this water right up here, that initial triangle that we did, we have very subtle details. It's a lot of horizontal lines, but the light, all of the highlights in it, are done with a pink. If you look at this area right here, it's very detailed. The application style is a bit different, but what makes it dramatically different is that all of our highlights here are done with a blue. Now it's time to kind of combine them. We're going to take the blues that we have in here as highlights, we're going to move them into the background. We're going to take the pinks that we have in the background, we're going to move them into the foreground, and then it'll really feel like one larger body of water, and it'll be really, really neat. So with that, let's jump into it, get a little bit closer, and continue just making this painting as good as we possibly can. So, as noted, we're now going to take these highlighted blues and move them up into this area. I'm going to be using this brush. We're going to be mixing that same blue that we used there, so I'll mix it in the same spot. Titanium white, cerulean blue, a little bit of Mars black, and we're almost there. That should work well. And now the water, it runs up, it starts to fall, it catches all of this highlight, and then it'll turn into this shadow highlight, because this isn't getting any direct light, it's in the opposite direction of our light. So now it's time to start doing what we did down here. So we start with those lines that fall, and then they start to move a bit more horizontally. You can start some at the bottom, you can start some in the middle. If you want to connect all of these different applications, you can. But I like to jump around from top to bottom quite a bit. I feel like it gives me more option later on. That way I don't accidentally do all of it at the top and then I'm forced to be less detailed in other areas. So here you can see creating that same nice rolling effect, slowly and steadily. Now these are all quite far away. They're more in the middle ground than the foreground. So you may not want to make any sharp lines and then do a blend down. But you also could if you're working on a fairly large canvas, and you can make it incredibly subtle. I don't think the canvas I'm working on here is large enough to do so. And if you're ever wondering on the size of canvas that I'm using, or really any of the materials, you can find all of that typed out in the video description, just to make that nice and easy. Of course, down there you can also find a link to the Patreon, where you can get the reference photo and the traceable to this guy. I find the reference photos are really quite useful, just because sometimes if I'm not getting the right color, I like to paint directly on a printed version of the reference photo. That way I can test the color, I can see how it's off, if it's off, or I can be reassured if it's exactly how it was meant to be. So I personally find that really useful. I have mine right here. my printer tends to skew a little bit blue, so my reference photo is a little bit blue, so I compensated a little bit, but still very useful. Here, I'm just using a damp brush to move out some of that paint. It's getting more subtle as we move into the back. And I might take just a hint of it and work it back into here in just some of those shadowy, darker non-pink areas. That way, again, it's nice and cohesive. Want all of our painting, every part of our painting to fit together. So, that right there is a really good start. Now, we'll grab some of our red, some of our white, quite a bit of our white. Start that. We can apply this right through here. Get a bit more of a highlight working its way down into the water. And you know what? I should really move the camera down for this. So we'll do that right now. So as you can see, I just started making a couple little strokes in there. This pink is lighter than the pinkish purple around it, but I do want it to be a bit brighter than that. I want it to be somewhat similar to this. And this highlight up there, it's quite desaturated because it has so much titanium white in it. And I want something similar. So there you can see I just grabbed a lot of titanium white. I still had a little bit of red on my brush. And this should be relatively close. It is. So now we can try mixing that in. See if we like it. We're problem solving right now. We're just trying a couple of different things. My reference photo says it's right in between our first pigment and this pigment. So you know what? I'll grab a little bit more red and I'll find that in between. Maybe just a hint more. Yeah. Give that a go. Okay, what I mixed was fairly similar. I am starting to like it a lot though. It's looking like this shimmering light in the water that's rolling up on the beach. I am keeping it predominantly in this strip right here. Remember, the middle is going to be a bit darker. But you know what? I actually like that it's a bit brighter. The more I do it, the more I like it. So I'll continue. Kind of working in between the blue areas that we've applied. There we go. As I start to run out of paint, I work more to the left and right hand side. That way I get a softer application. And that way the most bold and opaque applications are more so in the middle, where the reflection is the strongest. Time for more paint. While I'm making a lot of strokes, I am still trying to make sure that they are clean strokes. And if I feel they are not, I am going back over them. And essentially what I'm just trying to do there is ensure that I'm not creating strokes that show a lot of tooth of canvas, and I'm just trying to keep things nice and refined. We are in the foreground. This is where details are really created and seen. So this is an important area to put those very fine markings. It's a sunset. We started with the sunset. Generally that's a bit more tricky. So we put a lot of time and attention to that, but it's not time to stop trying. Now it's time to give it all we've got, finish it really strong. There we go. It's really starting to look like it's lit up. Now I'm using a very watery version of that mixture. And as you can see, it's much more transparent. I'm working my way in those darker non-blue areas as we move out from the light. And we'll also do that to the other side. Just about out of pigment and water at this point, so I'll add a little bit of water to my brush, grab a little bit of pigment, grab a little bit of water, make sure I don't have too much on that brush. So there you can see it's quite transparent, which is what we want for this part of the painting. There we go. Now I'm going to head up and do the same thing to this area right here. So here's another wide shot showing you again that in context with the rest of the painting. I probably went ahead and worked for another half an hour or so. Again, this is a process that you can be very meticulous with. You can really take your time, go over each application a number of times. I probably went over all of my little pink markings that you saw me making there 3 times. I applied it, I let it dry, I applied it, I let it dry, I applied it, and so on and so forth. Then I went ahead and I did that area as well. And as noted, this has a bit of a shadow here, so this area is a bit darker. This casts a little bit of a shadow here. These two are the highlighted areas, and this one is a little bit brighter than that one. So those are kind of the check boxes that you're looking to fill in there. And now we can continue, we can proceed with a couple of things. The first being adding a little bit of a pink highlight to the top of this wave, maybe a little bit of this highlight in between the 2 waves that we have, and then a bit of the blue that we have down here working its way and just resharpening some of those applications that we made previously that may now be a little bit less sharp after all of our pink applications. So we're going to go in, we're going to add some details, we're going to refine, and then we can move forward in the painting. So step 1 here is creating a bit of this pink highlight right on this. So we'll start with a little bit of our red, quite a bit of our titanium white. As we've learned through multiple applications, we do want significantly more titanium white than we're using red. And we'll give this a try. We'll test it on our previous wave. Looks fairly good. Now we'll apply it to the back portions of this one. And it can work its way slightly over that hump there. That way we can see that it is part of this wave, that the light is working its way down it. And when I move it on top of some of these blue pieces, I'm applying it to the top of the stroke, and then I might do a slight blend down. So similar to what we were doing with the highlights for that blue. Now I'm letting this be relatively subtle, and it's getting more and more subtle as we move into the background. There we go. Heading back over here, this is the sharpest area. It's closest to us. So you can create lots of little details here if you want to. I'm going to make sure my brush is a little bit more damp. That way I can continue to make these nice sharp markings. And I'll go over a couple of these areas a number of times just because the pigment is semi-transparent. There we go. Might even add a hint of it on some of these. Just the larger applications. It's really starting to come together. It's also quite interesting how, because we're making so many little strokes on a relatively small canvas, when you're up close you really notice the strokes and all of the implications, but when you stand back, even when I move the camera back, it really all kind of forms one cohesive piece. I always find that so interesting. There we go. So far, so good. Now, we'll head back here and we'll do a bit of that. So, yet again, a little bit of red. And I'm mixing a new area, just because it's good to continuously remix colors. Puts you in a situation where you're forced to practice. That way you remember for your future paintings. Do a little test. Oh, that looks so nice. Okay, coming back up here. I think it might be a little bit too washed out, a little bit too bright for back there. Need a bit more red. Give this a go. Again, most of these are in this motion. I'm glad we made it more red because it makes it stand out slightly more from the wave that we have right in front of it. And you don't have to do all of these. If you don't like a certain application of one type or sort, you don't have to do it. I might also move a little bit of this pink over this wave in the same way that we did this one. This is going to meld everything a little bit more. And then we'll do a bit over here, just because we do have that opening. But I want this to be significantly more subtle. There we go. Now, something I do feel could be adjusted is just how vibrant that is. Now that we have a good base, let's tone it down saturation-wise by just working in a little bit more of a titanium white. See, it makes it a little bit brighter, but it also takes out that really red application. And it actually makes it look a bit softer despite being the fact that it's more bright now. There, definitely better. With that said, it's now time to continue with our blue highlights. So here, I'll grab some of our cerulean blue, good amount of our titanium white, and remember we do use a hint of Mars black in this as well. Make it a bit brighter. Good. Now I'll find my more prominent areas and applications, and I'll go back and I will re-interject those. You can also make new ones as well if you feel things have changed when you've added the pink. And I do feel like that happens a lot. We do a lot of detail here. We go in with a general idea, but you know, we probably find little pieces we like a lot, we accentuate them. And so you have a lot of room to play, should you want it. There we go. Going with a slightly brighter blue than we did before. Matches the pink quite well. I think we'll keep the blue in the background as dark as it is though. I like the progression of values. There we are. Let's also take a bit more of that and work a little bit in between the pinks that we did up here. Soften it, breaking it up. There we go. Much better. These are little changes and details you can honestly make for hours, should you want to. I think I will personally refine this for another 15 minutes, where I will make some of the pinks a little bit brighter, a little bit darker, some of the blues a little bit brighter, a little bit darker, and then we'll progress together. So I didn't really make many changes to the water, the waves, or the reflections, but one thing I did do, I went back over these top waves here with a bit more blue. That way there's a combination of the blue and the pink. You can kind of see them through one another because the paints are semi-transparent, and I just think it gives it a much more interesting look. With that said, we are now going to continue moving down, and I'm switching to a brush. It's quite big. It is a flat-headed 1-inch brush here. I'm going to make sure that it is just a little bit damp as we do, and we're going to work on the sand and some of our reflection. So for this, I'm going to start by picking a pigment that's quite similar to the dark pigment that we have right there, and I believe that is quite a bit of red, a little bit of blue, good amount of Mars black, and then some titanium white. Mix these up, do a little test. It's close, should be a little bit darker, and maybe a little bit more gray. So we'll add more Mars black, more titanium white, give that a go, and that looks much more right. It's a little bit dark, but that's okay. And I'm going to create a little bit of a division between our new pigment and our previously applied pigment. And I'll start working this down. Now you can see that the more I work it, the more it becomes semi-transparent, and that's okay. When you do that, you can see what the color actually looks like, which is interesting, but we will have to go in with a much more thick pigment and build that up. So here I'm making much more paint than I did initially. I started with just a little bit so we could test it. Now in remixing it, we're getting a little bit of practice. There we go. And this will be our sand color. I think a lot of people innately, naturally think of sand as a bit more of a brown, a bit more of a tan pigment. But when you have all of these reds, purples reflecting, your sand is going to look different. And so that's what we're doing right now. We're just making a bit of a more interesting sand. Now, this is going to reflect on to the sand. It will make it lighter. We'll handle that in a little bit. Same goes for right here. Right now I am just building a relatively simple base layer. And I'd also like to note, for those of you who are on Patreon and who are using the reference photo, I am purposefully making the sand a bit brighter here. I think that it's really beautiful in the photo, and the photographer did an amazing job. I think in my version here though, I want it to be a little bit brighter. So that's what we're going to do. I'm also again creating this division line between the two, and it's going to be much more thin up here than it is down here. So it'll progressively get bigger. I'll show you just roughly like that. Now, yet again, we're mixing more pigment. Really quite a lot at this point. There we go. Maybe make it a little bit darker. And look at that. We made it a couple times. Practice has gone well, and we are getting quite accustomed to it. Trying to get a relatively thick base layer here. There we go. And my pigment is remaining as wet as it is for as long as it is because my brush is damp, and that water is working its way into the paint and it's extending the wet life of that paint. Again, we'll mix more. Lots and lots of mixing. It's kind of amazing that this is what a dark desaturated red looks like, isn't it? You look at it for long enough in the context of this painting and it doesn't really look like red. It kind of looks like sand, which is exactly what we want. So as you can see, the entirety of the base is now covered, but I am going to get a bit more Mars Black now, make it slightly darker, and I'll work that right here closest to us. This back left-hand corner. And I'll blend that in a little bit. And this way we have some depth. And the sand itself is quite dark. What's making this as bright as it is the fact that it's wet. And when it's wet, it can have light reflect off of it. So as we get farther back and the sand gets less and less wet, it's going to progressively get darker. And that's what we're showing here. Now, I do recognize that we are working on quite a large area, and that if we work a little bit more slowly, all of this will be dry. So, if you are working a little bit more slowly and you're having a hard time getting this blend, you can go over it with another layer of both the dark and the light, or you can use some relatively damp brushes and work wet onto dry, which is generally how we paint with acrylic. But here I do have an opportunity to work wet into wet, so that's what I'm doing. And I'm slowly just building up that darker back area, creating a slight vignette. And you do that because generally the eye, it innately goes to the brightest point of any piece. And if we can make that the middle, that's great, because that means the eye isn't going to wander off the edges. You can see just how many times I'm doing this. I'm making it incredibly subtle with each new application, that way I don't make it too much. And you know what? I think that right there looks really, really nice. I like that a lot. So now I'm just cleaning my brush quite well. And now we can head back in with the smaller flat-headed brush and create a bit of a reflection down on our sand. So I'm going to look for more of this pink that we have. Grab some of that. At this point, our palette might look a little bit sparse. We did just use quite a bit of paint. But we'll start with a nice bright red. We'll test it right in here. It's a good base pigment. And I'll work this now over some of our sand. I'm starting by creating the openings the same way we did in the back with the blue. Starting up at the edge, that way it's nice and opaque. And then as I move towards the left and the bottom, I let that paint run out. I get a much more soft application. This will work a little bit better if the background is still wet, but mine is almost dry at this point, so I'm really relying on the fact that the brush is damp at this point. There we go. I think this is the part that most people really love the look of. I know I do. It's that very subtle, very thin amount of water on the sand, catching beautiful reflection. I'm going to make this a bit more dramatic than the reference photo. Again, gorgeous reference photo. I just want to take some artistic liberties and play with it a bit. And that's something I recommend you do with all of my tutorials and lessons too, by the way. You know, interject pieces of yourself. Have fun. If you have another idea or you want to change something slightly, by all means, go ahead, make it your own in that way. You're also, of course, more than welcome to follow along to a T. We're now getting to that middle area that is a bit darker, so I'm letting it really just run out of paint here. And I'm trying to get as much of a transition from opaque bright pink to transparent pigment right here. It's going so well. I'm really happy with this one. Again, sunsets can be quite tricky. So when it goes this well, it's such a rewarding feeling. Also, I know I'm including a lot of footage in this video. It'll probably be a bit of a longer video, but I think it's just one of those where there's so much to do, so much to talk about. It's worth the extra time. There we go. At this point, the markings are barely noticeable. They might not even be noticeable in camera. Little hints of light here and there. That one kind of happened by accident, but I love it. So anyways, now I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit more down here. And because I think I'll probably spend another 10 minutes doing this, building it up, doing all the details, I think we'll cut this here and I'll see you in the next clip to continue working on our waves. So as you can see, quite a bit has changed, and I did go on to do this side over here, but I would like to note that the white line that we were kind of working around is now gone, and that happened for kind of a funny reason. I continued the tutorial where I started painting that in with a darker pigment, and then I kind of looked at it, I thought about it, and I said, you know what? I can teach this in a better way. So instead of painting it individually, I decided to just kind of work it into what we already had. So I took more of that sand pigment, I put it there. I took more of our pinks, I put them in between, and I just kind of expanded in that way until we ended up with this, which means that the canvas is now entirely covered in paint, which is always very exciting, but it also means that we can continue our wave here in, I think, a significantly more simple way than what I was initially going to do. So with that, this is just about dry. I'm going to take that smaller flat-headed brush, we'll take our blue, titanium white, and we'll mix up a blue that's a little bit brighter, a little bit more saturated than what we had before in the waves. And it looks like this is a good version of that. And I'll find a connective piece like that, or start working them out a bit more. And I'll move my way up and down the shoreline, going back and forth like this. Now your line work here can be significantly larger in this area of the painting because it's closer to us. But as you get farther back, you need to make those strokes smaller. And if you can do it with a slightly more transparent application, it will look better. You want it to be nice and subtle back here. Again, we're moving farther away from us, so perspective is going to make this look smaller. It's going to blend those colors optically a little bit more. So there we go. And you can also go back in and incorporate more of these, like this. So we'll move in, and then we'll continue that. We'll move in, and then we'll continue it out to this bigger one. But this is the water washing up. I'm painting this quite differently from our reference photo, but I wanted it to be a bit more subtle. I really like it when there isn't a definitive line between water and sand. I like it when that reflection kind of carries onward. And I just think it's such a nice effect. So here, I'll get a little bit more of that water, that blue, work it forward. This time, however, I'm not really going to connect it to this backing area. I just let it kind of run off this way. You see it gets more transparent. I also try to taper the edges a little bit. And you can blend it back as well if you have a lot of water on your brush. There we go. So the idea is that we have this one continuous line that kind of zigzags back and forth with little bits of a curve, and then both in front and behind it we have these additional pieces. And I might make one a little bit brighter, a bit more opaque as we come forward in the painting. Just getting a bit more of that highlight. Going and working it into some of these other pieces, predominantly in the middle section. Again, as we get to those edges, we want it to get softer and softer. Maybe I'll work a little bit more here. That's so nice. You can really see the pink light just dancing over all of it. This is much, much more simple than the other way I was going to teach it. I'm glad I ended up redoing that. Again, a testament to the fact that if you want something done right, redoing it isn't a bad thing. There we go. We can also use a bit of this to create just a soft wash if you want, like that. It's going to kind of dampen the darker shadows, make it a bit more cohesive visually. And that's just when you have a very wet brush, a very minuscule amount of pigment. We'll do it over here. It's like working a wash or a glaze. I'll blend that out. It's even more reflective now. There we go. Get a little bit more. Just softening a couple of areas, that way there are some heavy impact areas that have a lot of contrast, like here and here, that really pop. To do something like this and create a little bit of a wash and deglaze, you do need to make sure that the rest of your painting is entirely dry. Otherwise, you can either rip up a little bit of that paint or start moving it and blending it. And that's not what we want to do. We just want to give a very thin layer of this whitish blue to soften everything, to make everything look a little bit more cohesive, to take down those high contrast areas in a couple of spots. And you can see that I'm applying very minimal amounts each time, and I'm slowly just building it up. You don't want to apply a lot initially. There we go. Still working in horizontal strokes, just in case any of these strokes do show through in the end. You want them to still look like it's water moving in that same way. Take a bit more titanium white. Now that this blue's dried, we can come back in and add a bit more of a highlight to it. I'm going to apply this to the tops of these blue applications. Get a bit more. And we'll add a bit of a highlight to it. That way it has some depth. The light works its way down. And you can apply it to the top and then just do a very soft little subtle blend downwards. Again, this is all very small, but it's a detail that's really appreciated if you get up close to the painting. It's also a great opportunity to give some of these a little bit more form and definition, should you want them to have it. Now that I'm almost out of paint, I'm just creating these almost transparent waves here. Just little bits that haven't fully receded yet. There we go. Might even bring it into the background a little bit. Or at least the back of the foreground. I suppose not the true background. But isn't this fun? This is where it all comes together. This is where those highlights really pop, where all of these layers start to make sense, and where your painting really finds that magic. I am honestly kind of astonished that this turned out as well as it did. I'm really, really happy. Again, sunsets can be a little bit more difficult. I feel like we took some extra time, we redid some things, and it paid off. Here I'm accentuating a couple of those arches. Could just do this for hours. Now we're just going to take a little bit of that titanium white, a little bit of our cerulean blue, significantly more titanium white though. Oh, accidentally grabbed a little bit of red there. We'll just continue mixing until that is out of the system. And then once we have this, we can pick a few select waves and just give them a little bit of a highlight here on the side that's facing us. This is going to give it a lot more depth and a little bit of a shine. Trying to make sure these are incredibly subtle though. You want these to be the smallest markings they can possibly be. And again, these are strokes that are going to have larger middles and smaller edges. You want them to taper. So I have a lot of water on my brush, that way I get these very small sharp strokes. I'm using almost no pressure, sometimes just the corner of my brush. And I'm also leaving openings in the edges here. That way there's a slight inconsistency. It looks natural, they don't all look the same. And you can see that I'm doing it in the background here, but it's as the paint runs out. It's as these get a bit more transparent. And then I might come back and do a little bit more. Anyways, there we have it. That is our completed acrylic landscape scene for the week. And I have to say, honestly, this is my favorite. This is my favorite acrylic lesson that we've done together. And this is actually being recorded a couple of days later post finishing the piece. And I still feel that way. And that's important because generally, I feel like when I finish an acrylic lesson over the following couple of days, when I kind of give it a little glance here and there, I say, oh, you know what, maybe I'll go back and I'll change that, or oh, maybe I'll try that, or maybe I'll fix that. But with this one, I don't have any changes, I don't have any fixes. I'm just really pleased with how it turned out, and that is such a rewarding, wonderful feeling that I hope you are also sharing with your piece and your experience with this one as well. And if you are about to go and start it, remember you can get the traceable and the reference photo up over on Patreon, and those should really help you with both the drawing process and the color mixing process as well. So do consider that. I would also like to say a big thank you to all of the patrons. On the note of Patreon, this channel is fan funded. All of these lessons occur because of the incredible people over on Patreon. Wouldn't be doable without them. So truly thank you to all of you for just making this happen each and every week. And if you would like to support the channel up over on Patreon, just say thank you, get all of that bonus stuff. There is a lot of extra bonus stuff up there as well. We have a private Facebook group where we all kind of share our artwork, help each other. I also do personalized reviews, and I have all 5 of my ebooks up there right now as well. So if you've ever wanted acrylics for beginners and you didn't want to buy it separately over on Etsy, you can get that there, as well as all of my painting prompts books, which are just full of traceables for those uninspired days. So there's a lot up there. I do recommend going and checking it out. There is a link in the description. And above, again, all of that bonus stuff, it's what makes this channel work, and it keeps the lights on. So truly thank you for stopping by. I will see you next week with a brand new painting lesson. And I suppose I always say I'll see you next week with a new painting lesson, but that only actually occurs if you press the subscribe button, but also more importantly, the bell button, because that is what's going to notify you when those new lessons come out. That way they don't just kind of get lost in your subscription feed. So do click that bell button, and then I actually will see you next week with a brand new painting lesson. And I'm really excited about some of the big things that we have coming up, and I think you'll be really pleased. So with that said, I will see you soon, and above all, as always, stay creative.